They're watching us now.
Okay,
2 of them are at least.
I'll tell you later.
Oh, 3. I was right that we would get 3.
Well, so all 3 of them get to know that the system sent the reminder yesterday, just close enough to 6 o'clock my time for my not to look at the day. And I thought, oh my God, on in 2 minutes, I somehow got the day wrong. And I ran screaming from my room, to put on a proper shirt or something.
Sorry about that.
Should we give it another 2-3 minutes and then start at 6:05?
Okay.
Okay. Okay. I think we should start now, right?
Yep.
What do you think? Yeah? Okay, great. So, good evening. My name is Nora Salem. I am going to be the moderator of today's event, and I would like to welcome our listeners. Thank you for attending this event, and our speakers, Dr. Jason Beckett and Dr. Geoff Gordon, to today's seminar on the fragmentation of international lawyers at AUC's Law Department lecture series. Let me quickly introduce the speakers. Jason is assistant professor in the law department at the American University in Cairo, AUC, with a research focus on international legal theory and global poverty. He'll be presenting approximately for 35 to 40 minutes. And Dr. Geoff is senior researcher at the Acer Institute Center for International and European Law, with a research focus on international dispute settlement, international legal theory, international technology law, law and society studies, public international law, and transnational legal relations. He be presenting for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, and that will be followed by a Q&A session of you listeners out there. So without any further ado, let me give the mic and the space to Jason.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Geoff, for agreeing to attend and discuss my somewhat disparate ideas. Thank you all for coming to listen to my somewhat disparate ideas. So this paper is my attempt to describe international law as I now understand it. A long time ago, I understood international law as a relatively determinate, relatively just set of rules, by reference to which experts could evaluate and judge international conduct. I no longer see that understanding of international law as valid. My description takes place in a context, and that context is the contemporary global order and the misery that this produces. I juxtapose this context to what I see as the eschatological dreams of international law. Things like the Sustainable Development Goals that allow us to believe that we are making progress in eradicating poverty, protecting the environment, protecting human rights, when I would argue we are doing no such thing. To put this differently, we do not live in a tolerably just world. Human suffering is neither isolated nor exceptional, but is in fact the norm for the majority of the globe's citizens. In a little more detail, 70% of the global population live on less than $10 a day after purchasing power parity calculations have been carried out. 700 million people live on less than $2 a day after purchasing power parity calculations. 50,000 people die every day from poverty-related causes. That's 350,000 people per week, 1 million people every 3 weeks. 18 million avoidable human deaths every year. That is the price that we pay for the current global legal order. Every year, the overdeveloped world gives the underdeveloped states $126 billion in development aid. That number, I hope, has gone up a little bit with environmental aid to also be included, but it is certainly less than $200 billion a year. Every year, the overdeveloped states extract $3 trillion in cash and undervalued resources from the underdeveloped states. In other words, every year, the poor subsidize the rich by at least $3 trillion. As a result of this, 15% of the global population accounts for 85% of global consumption. These people, who include myself and probably yourselves, are largely hidden and protected in the world's largest gated community, the community I call the overdeveloped world, the community others call the international community. The current atrocities at the border between Poland and Belarus show just how fiercely the overdeveloped world will guard the gates of their community. Guarding those gates so effectively, keeping others out, keeping resources in, leaves 15% of global consumption for the remaining 85% of humanity. That, and that alone, is why poverty exists, why migration exists, why human rights abuses exist, and it is why also the overdeveloped world continues to reinforce its walls and its gates and its fortress. The paradox for global justice is that international law takes place in this context. Its practice of discursively constructing ethical worlds plays out against this backdrop of violence and deprivation. It imagines justice from the heart of the fortress, from the center of empire, from the centers of the overdeveloped world. As a result, international law, I hope accidentally, distracts from the system of immiseration which supports it, but it does so at the expense of billions of human beings' well-being. That global order of immiseration is regulated by law, but it is not the order that I want to talk about today. The order I want to talk about today is the order that we are used to calling public international law, or the discourse that we are used to calling public international law. My argument today is that public international law is fragmented. It is fragmented along the disciplinary lines. We have trade law, we have human rights law, we have humanitarian law, we have general international law, environmental law. So it's fragmented along disciplinary lines, but it's also fragmented along methodological lines. In other words, international lawyers are not trained to be international lawyers as such. Rather, they're trained to represent the postures, the performances, and the preferences of those who trained them and the communities in which they professionally developed. I believe that this training and the beliefs that it constructs help to differentiate international lawyers into distinct communities where they engage with one another and occasionally with neighboring communities, but not with the majority of other international lawyers and not with the majority of what I would call international law. What I'm seeking then is a more comprehensive understanding of what people call the practice of international law. So international law is fragmented at the disciplinary level, and I will argue through this paper that it's fragmented at the methodological or theoretical level. That is, that international lawyers, different international lawyers, learn to do international law differently. They learn to recognize different texts as sacred, different institutions as authoritative, different argumentative techniques as competent. One reason for this is that international law is radically indeterminate. And I could spend a whole paper describing the indeterminacy of law, but I want to hone in on one specific factor about international law. And that is this: there is too much international law. There are too many arguments, there are too many articles, there are too many treaties, there are too many reports, too many recommendations, too many argumentative techniques, too many institutions. There is too much international law. International law proliferates in an unconstrained manner. This is because international law is not institutionalized. International law has institutions, including famously the International Court of Justice, but these institutions lack the authority held by domestic legal institutions and courts. And this is problematic. It's problematic for two reasons. One, the identification of law, the impartial identification of law, depends on the ability to view law as it is enforced. So in order to know what a legal rule is, we must know what the authoritative institution will enforce on a regular basis. In international law, there is no authoritative institution to enforce their interpretation of the law, and therefore all interpretations of the law are valid. This leads to a second point, what Robert Cover calls the jurispathic function of law. So Cover argues that the court was designed not to create law, but to destroy law. That the court came into being because of a surplus of law, and that the court, in recognizing one law or one interpretation as correct, one argumentative technique as correct, also recognized the other techniques, the other arguments as incorrect. So the purpose of the court, in part, is to prune law, to ensure that law does not become overabundant. And in international law, there is no court to serve that function. This means, amongst other things, that no international legal argument is objectively better than any other, and no body, no person or institution in international law is entitled to authoritatively determine what the law is. The law is, for this structural reason and many other reasons, radically indeterminate. International lawyers, be they academics, practitioners, or students, routinely provide claims about the law. They claim to describe a legal system which I am arguing does not exist. They tell us that human rights have been breached, that humanitarian law has been broken, that refugee rights are not being recognized or upheld. But none of what they produce has any material effect in the world. Nothing is enforced, no ruling is authoritative. We cannot see law, we cannot see international law in material reality. What we hear instead are incessant and inconsistent claims about the nature and content of that law. These claims are produced by denying the radicality of indeterminacy in international law. We learn preferred ways of constructing international law, preferred hierarchies of sources and institutions, preferred texts, and preferred argumentative techniques. We put those into play to show our professional competence and our capacity to impartially judge world events. But our analyses can always be countered by the analyses of others. Our objectivity is not real, and our claims about law are not necessary. I call these claims false necessities. And my simple claim is any demand, any claim made on behalf of international law can be met by an equally competent counterclaim. Neither claim is necessary, neither claim is objective, and neither claim is better than the other because there is no authoritative system of ranking claims. We judge the claims in essence on ethical and aesthetic grounds. So any claim as to what is the best or the objective answer to a question of international law is necessarily a false necessity. Drawing on Susan Mark's work, I would say that such claims are also what she calls false contingencies. Marx acknowledges, following Roberto Unger, that the social world, including the law, is contingent and constructed. It can change, it can be changed. Neoliberalism is not a scientific truth, it is a politically imposed background condition. However, the complexity of Susan's analysis is that there are barriers to change, and in particular, there are barriers to progressive change in the world. There are reasons that things are the way that they are, and there are vested interests, as we saw with the virtual collapse of COP26, there are vested interests in maintaining things in the way that they are. So change remains possible, but not all possibilities are equal. A false contingency, in my analysis, is a possibility or a legal claim that is unlikely to be realized for mappable structural reasons. So in this sense, the right to food is a false contingency. The right to food will never feed people because the problem isn't a lack of rights. The problem is the way that food is distributed by the background system. So most claims about international law, almost all claims about international law, go unrealized. International law is, as they say, unenforced and honored in the breach. But false contingency also alerts us that some legal claims are realized. Some legal claims take effect in the real world. To recall, international law is radically indeterminate. All potential international conduct is simultaneously legal and illegal. And this means, if we follow it to its logical conclusion, that what we are taught to think of as violations of international law are also realizations or actualizations of international law. Recently, the International Court of Justice held that Britain had no claim to sovereignty over the Chagos Islands. This was a bold claim that Britain's continuing occupation of the islands would constitute a violation of international law. Yet Britain does continue to exercise sovereignty over those islands. The United States continues to maintain its naval base there, and the people of the Chagos Islands remain dispossessed, excluded. That latter scenario is part of international law. The US military is part of international law. It relies on international law to move troops, to obtain equipment, to move equipment, to enter other countries, to set up military bases, to supply its troops. Britain and her fading memories of empire are also products of international law. And her continuing sovereignty over the Chagos Islands is in fact the current actualization of international law, despite the ICJ's protestations that it is somehow unlawful. This maps onto a distinction that Jeff calls the distinction between material international law and ethical international law. Material international law is the law that affects the real world, be it in military maneuvers or trade and resource allocation. Ethical law is the law that we're used to thinking of as international law, the project of the international community to bring us towards an ever more just world. The point that I want to make is that material international law is material precisely because it is actualized, it is enforced and realized. Ethical international law is immaterial precisely because it is not enforced and it is not complied with. One outcome of this lack of material force is that international law is capable of maintaining concurrent and conflicting paradigms of legal practice. So Thomas Kuhn famously showed how scientific thinking has moved through a series of paradigms, and that the act of moving from one paradigm to the other is not a rational act, but a leap of faith until the new paradigm is entrenched and reestablishes rationality. David Harvey argues that these paradigm shifts happen for material reasons. When a scientific paradigm cannot solve materially relevant points, it comes under challenge and under the risk of being replaced. But international law has the advantage of not dealing with materially relevant points, and therefore conflicting paradigms, conflicting approaches to international law can coexist without problem. This, I think, is what leads to the fragmentation of international lawyers. We're each trained to inhabit a particular paradigm, a particular community-produced understanding of the meaning, content, and importance of international law. Michael Weibel and Andrea Bianchi have analyzed these communities under the guise of interpretive communities, epistemic communities, and communities of practice. I owe a lot to Weibel and Bianchi's analyses, but I think that they are limited by the analyst's own assumptions and desires, and by the baggage that the concepts they borrow from other disciplines bring along. International lawyers are not interpretive communities, are not members of interpretive communities. An interpretive community is a place where individuals learn how to make meaning out of text. But it is not a place where individuals learn to construct texts. Stanley Fish's claim that the text, the understanding of the text, is always a mixture between the text and the background assumptions of the reader is fundamentally correct. But international lawyers do more than interpret texts. They create texts, they create norms, they create what appears to be knowledge about international law. Epistemic communities is a concept borrowed from constructivist international relations. And epistemic communities are communities which create knowledge, but they don't reflect well the conditions of international law. Epistemic communities must have social capital and policy influence. International law largely lacks this. They must be cohesive and effective. International law is neither, and there can only be one epistemic community or one dominant community per discipline, and that is again missing in international law. I would argue that international lawyers instead are formed in communities of practice. Communities of practice are similar to epistemic communities, but they do not require policy relevance, and they can proliferate within a single discipline. According to Beverly and Etienne Wenger-Trainer, communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. A commitment to the domain and a shared competence distinguishes members from other people. This allows them to engage in joint activities and discussions, help each other and share information, to build relationships that enable them to learn from each other. Members of a community of practice develop a shared repertoire of resources, experiences, stories, tools, and ways of addressing recurring problems. Learning can be the reason for the community to come together or an incidental outcome of the community's interactions. Communities evaluate the competence of their members who care about their standing with each other. But policy relevance or impact is not important to the identification or existence of communities of practice. Indeed, their expertise is not necessarily something recognized as expertise out with the community. So communities of practice operate like epistemic communities. They generate their members' worldview, the postures and the performances they see as competent or exemplary. They embody the imagined legal system that they have each individually constructed. For example, an international lawyer could be a positivist, a constitutionalist, and an environmental lawyer with regulative leanings. They could be a natural lawyer with an ethically redistributive morality and a focus on trade law. They could be either a militarist or a humanist within international humanitarian law. International lawyers are either constructed or fragmented or altered along a series of different axes. I sketched down a few, but I'm still developing this idea. We are constructed or fragmented in terms of our specializations, trade, humanitarian law, environmental law, etc. We're constructed and fragmented along our methodological commitments, what we see as sources, which institutions we see as authoritative, what we see as counting as data, legal argumentation, or legal rules. We're constructed, fragmented theoretically as positivists, natural lawyers, functionalists, crits, etc. We're fragmented by interpretative posture, from the strict textualists to the most extreme teleologists. Indeed, Monica Hakimi, in an interesting paper last year, analyzed customary international law in a way that provoked some consternation in the European community, and indeed a short symposium on the Opinio Juris blog site. What was striking for me about Hakimi's paper was it showed the continuing influence of the New Haven School, a school which Europeans have largely been taught to think of as dead. And I think that the reason for this is that Hakimi was describing a community of international lawyers that we are not used to describing from a European perspective. She was describing the practice of the lawyers and the interlocutors of the State Department of the United States. Lawyers that at least since the invasion of Iraq, we have been taught to think of as manipulative or incompetent, yet international lawyers as much as any of us can claim to be. We're fragmented in our global assumptions, what we think of the current state of the world, what we think of as relevant to our analyses, what we think of as relevant to the world, how we think the world should be. Should we have a global union? Should we have power blocks? Should we have a global hegemon? All of these positions have support within international law. We're fragmented also on our ethical assumptions, on our assumptions about what a just world or a just legal system would look like. In other words, international lawyers are constructed by background and training, exposure and experience. It's actually, I think, wrong to say that they are fragmented, and better to say that they were never whole in the first place, but rather there was an agglomeration of discrete communities into something that became recognized as the discourse of international law. So what do these communities of practice do? Well, my argument following Nicholas Rajkovic's work is that they perform legality. So I will draw a distinction. Judges and lawyers, particularly municipal judges and lawyers, and police and jailers and bailiffs, these officials do law. They implement and practice law. Academics and international lawyers produce performances of legality. We dictate what we think it means to do law, and we dictate how we think law ought to be done. So Rajkovic developed the concept of performances of legality based on his research into lawfare. And lawfare, in Rajkovic's reading, is a mutation of international humanitarian law, where law moves from the background to the foreground of hostilities. That is, where IHL is weaponized and used partisanly to demonstrate legality or illegality. This opens up a separate battlefield in which these discursive formations of international law compete for global attention and prestige. But Rajkovic argues that the concept of lawfare is inadequate because, and I quote, it relies explicitly on a compulsory rather than an institutional theory of power, while law and international humanitarian law have an inherent institutional quality. I think Rajkovic is wrong here. I think that law has an inherent institutional quality, but I don't think that humanitarian law does, because I don't think that humanitarian law is law. And yet, humanitarian lawyers do think that it is law. Unlike other international lawyers, they assume that they operate within an institutional context where institutional theories of power are important. If this assumption is taken as given, then what the participants are doing are something more. According to Rajkovic, they are producing performances of legality, which should be understood as patterned actions directed at an organized context, which aim to construct appearances of lawfulness or illegality. Their chief goal is validation from a global audience of legal experts, public opinion, and sovereign decision makers. These are professional exercises in international law, techniques for weaponizing international law's radical indeterminacy for partisan ends. But perhaps paradoxically, as a result of that, the term performances does not imply cynical theatrics, but rather concerted action to display legality or illegality as an integral part of warfare. My contention is that as practicing or academic international lawyers, we are trained to produce performances of legality. Our formative communities give us the assumptions that we need to suppress the indeterminacy of international law by excluding alternative arguments as incompetent or beyond the pale. We exercise these performances by analyzing international conduct or international tribunals and either praising or complaining about their performance. Those performances, I would argue, are aimed primarily at members of our own communities of practice. We can overlook their lack of effect in material reality because of their gratiating effect of bringing us recognition, prestige, publications, awards, if we are lucky, professional lives and salaries. But none of these performances can be judged. The judgment is purely external. According to Rajkovic, this has led to a distinctive struggle between adversaries over appearances of legality and illegality, which has produced an institutional and narrative battle space of growing importance, which I conceptualize as vicarious litigation. Vicarious litigation is litigation without a court. For Hugh Thirlway, like vicarious litigation took place in a hypothetical court. Ronald Dworkin went so far as to suggest that we simply imagine the court in which our vicarious litigations will take place. For Rajkovic, they take place in metaphorical courts, tribunals of experts, NGOs, or special rapporteurs, or human rights committees, or Red Cross decision-making. But vicarious litigation, according to Rajkovic, is dangerous. Vicarious litigation can readily escalate into a vortex of militarized legalism with no actual court for resolution, which, while proliferating references to legality, paradoxically disables the institutional coherence, authority, and power of IHL. But this is simply false. IHL was never coherent. It was always a contested discursive space where militarists, humanists, weapons fetishists fought, conflicted, disagreed, entered vicarious litigation. It was just never made public before lawfare. So vicarious litigation does not disable institutional coherence, it reveals the absence of institutional coherence. It does not disable authority, it reveals the absence of authority as it reveals the absence of power. And this is true of both humanitarian law and public international law more widely. So once we learn to understand international law as a series of concurrent performances of legality in vicarious litigation, we expose this same lack of coherence, of authority, and of power. In fact, it seems to me plausible that the various performers of international law work primarily for their communities, for community recognition and professional recognition. I don't mean this in a cynical way. I don't suggest cynicism, but rather an idealized commitment to their own community's imagined legal system. Their practice is a simulacrum. Drawing on Pierre Schlag, international law's substitutions of simulacrum for original are often invisible because they're effectuated by and throughout the discipline. As a result, international lawyers all too often settle for and settle into the pursuit of a simulacrum of the object of their desire. The performers subconsciously prioritize perfecting their imagined web of legal obligations, their imaginary legal system, over actually creating a better world, which I truly believe is the object of their desire. That is, international lawyers are trained to assume that our interventions are both objective and important, but we receive validation for that assumption only within our own communities of practice, and hence we perform for them. I want to say in closing, though, that this is not a call for people to stop doing international law. What I'm asking instead is that we begin to ask what it means to do international law. What are we doing and why are we doing it? What is happening as a result of what we are doing and what we are producing? Why do bad things continue to happen? And why do our analyses, our legal claims, our judgments, our demands, and our rulings consistently fail to lead to a better world? Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for these very interesting and thought-provoking ideas. Thank you for sharing that. Geoff, maybe I'm going to give the floor to you, and then we'll have a Q&A session. And given the size of the participants, I don't think we need to collect the questions. We can just, yeah, you can just raise your hand, and then you'll be given the floor. Okay.
Great. I'll even take things out of order and just say for participants, I don't know if Jason can, but I can't see any of you. So feel free to shout out, not to wait on
each other.
Okay. So yeah, so first, this is a really big honor for me, and a real challenge for the same reason. Jason, your work has been enormously influential to me, and part of the difficulty of doing this is because many times I feel that I failed the aspirations that or the objectives that your work sets out for me. Okay, and then on a more pragmatic basis, the sweep of the paper that that underlies this talk is huge. So I've laid out a series of notes, and I've been feverishly trying to sort of adjust them to the way that it comes through from the talk. I'm even tempted, I certainly don't want to speak for 20 minutes, but when I work from notes, I tend to ramble on too long. So every time I say something like that, I wind up speaking longer than I say what I don't want to do. But I'll really try not to. I would even invite you to jump in and interrupt me at points, because the notes are, I'll be working off of some text that I'll be quoting back from the paper, which at points may be a little bit different from how it came out in the talking or not. So I'd be curious if there's points that you want to question or correct as I'm going. I really don't mind, but I don't mean to burden you with that as an obligation either. Okay, so I'll start with one framing observation. There's a long focused hyper focus on the frustrations, the slippery frustrations of a structural indeterminacy in international law. Yeah. But in this paper in particular, I ask where that leads. The paper concludes with something that you started with in your spoken comments, that this paper, the quote in the paper is, "This has been a very long in the making," and it closes in parentheses, "for now an inquiry." But so then my question is, what comes next? What comes after the closure? And with that, what does this lead to? And so with that in mind, most of my observations and questions, I would like to sort of ask with a sense of interest in strategy and tactics that follow, that are possible or not possible on the basis of this inquiry, and the role that theory might play in conjunction with material practices for both strategy and tactics. So there's a huge challenge laid out in the paper, especially in the way that some of the big blocks that it's wrestling with are laid out. At one point, there's a quote that you're working with contradictory conclusions. PIL was unrelated to these many injustices. PIL was complicit in these injustices. PIL caused these injustices. These seemingly contradictory attributions are part of this structural space that's incredibly slippery. Another quote elsewhere, PIL appeared unmoored from reality. It is unmoored from reality, but that is not the whole story. Beneath the indeterminate claims of PIL, another legal system is operating, not PIL, yet not PIL. And here the rabbit hole is starting to form with the multiplication of negatives. This is the system I now call the GLO. It is a distinct and functionally differentiated subsystem of what I had thought of as the contradictory and indeterminate domain of international economic law. It looked like PIL, and it was derived from and intertwined with PIL, but it was not PIL. IEL was the gateway to understanding. It was also the barrier to understanding because IEL is not part of the GLO. I don't actually have a problem with the diagnosis there, but it's incredibly complex relationality that's getting set out. And I'd like to distinguish the sort of relationality that might allow a better purchase on that really dense set of interconnections. And I don't, my biggest concern is that I don't think that the paper, the study that's completed gives me that yet, the purchase on that relationality. And so I'll come back to that in a bit. Now sort of breaking down the different parts that are productive for me and that worry me. There's a reel at work in the paper, but there's sort of multiple reels. At the conclusion of the paper, the starting point of the talk is the monstrous reel that is manifest. Yeah? But then there's also something else that's set off by its imaginary counterparts. There's the faux courts and faux legislators. This is a quote, that are treated as real courts and legislators. By the time, when I set off all of these relations of falsity and immateriality against the monstrous real, I wonder whether I have access to the real in any way. And here again, in a vocabulary of strategy and tactics, that means, how do you resist it? It feels, because the monstrous real follows all of these productions of unreality, it feels unreachable. There's too many layers of unreality for me yet to understand how I could get a hold of it and do something with it. The real that emerges is monolithic and inaccessible at once, and that I'm terribly uncomfortable about that in terms of how I would engage it. There's elements of order and disorder in the field that I'd love to unpack more. There's quote internal functioning and non-interactions of diffuse and diverse communities. One thing that I didn't expect that triggered for me is an overlap with vocabularies that something like systems theory might deploy. Yeah, and that seems to point in directions that I think are worth interrogating, including why these discursive boundary points show up in the way that they do. There's another quote, the techniques deployed to deny or domesticate indeterminacy within groups only increase the level of indeterminacy between groups. This language sounds like a language of increasing order internal to the many groups that are forming. Yeah? But that seems to conflict with the wide open plain that describes PIL later in the paper, the quote, vast undifferentiated normative plane. So why does this matter to me? Because identifying the order in these ordering mechanisms seems to me to point or to obscure the places to intervene, where to take the fight. Yeah. There's another quote that, especially now that I've been sort of triggered on the systems theory riff, that I want to push back on at one point, and sometimes I'm not sure that how I ought to be reading it. So I think some of this is probably an illegitimate reading of the paper. But there's a quote: "PIL has no materiality beyond itself." It points to where it corresponds with the paper. It points to a wholly immaterial discursive phenomenon. But I disagree with that strongly. I think it obscures the materiality of the field. That exists outside of the sort of behemoth of the GLO. So is the field really as homogeneous as the sort of undifferentiated plane would suggest? There's another quote: many distinct communities can be discerned. This entails that they coexist in the same time and place. Now, here is where I think there's an opening to get into more of the materialities. I don't think that these communities do necessarily exist in the same time and space. There's a lot of socio-technical connections across and around fields that allow them to operate according to different times, that allow their spatial dimensions to be differently experienced. And these materialities, I think, might be able to bridge this separation from the real that exists through all of these unrealities, insofar as they're together with material things. And I wonder if there isn't more that can be brought out there, and I'll come back to that in one other sort of methodological register in a second. Instead of going in this direction, though, I read in the paper a bit of a Scylla and Charybdis type dilemma. On the one hand, this hyperproduction of unreality, which may or may not have a systems theory overlay, but in any event has all of these discursive unreality elements. And on the other hand, a very sort of Austinian thing. Yeah. The quote, this enforcement makes the rules, speaking to, and here we're really in the hardcore institutional heart of the GLO, right? The WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, the system of international arbitration, though that might look a little different than the other three. This enforcement makes the rules, and their authoritative interpretations makes them visible. In turn, this hardcore of institutional something underlies a wider production. Their content is objectively determinable because it's inscribed in the fabric of social reality. Because they are consistently imposed, routinely obeyed, and enforced against recalcitrant states, their content is relatively determinate. And yet the paper is not content, I don't think, to simply say, look, there's three institutions. People know their work, people criticize their work, and that's where we have to invest our energies. Right. That's our very clear front. I mean, and I think rightly that front line isn't adequate. That there's more going on. And I bring that down to one methodological choice of the paper. The paper proposes to do a topography of the field, a mapping exercise of the field. And that stays with a set of mapped representations and signifiers. And I wonder in its place whether a topology might give more purchase. A topology focusing on relations rather than a sort of graphically rendered system of representations. Because I think that, you know, the production of the paper doesn't resolve simply into contest the WTO here, because the WTO and the system of relations that supports it is more resilient than the attack on that front line will allow. And here my struggle with that last quote. So I wonder whether whether the next step now isn't the topological one, to understand the materiality of the relationality of this field that is or is not the monolith of the GLO. I think it's both broader and less monolithic, in that a more thorough rendering of the relationality might create a better plan for resistance to it. Yeah. Okay, so and for this, then I'll stay a little bit longer with the paper, but I hope I'm doing okay for time. I actually already want to start to push towards wrapping up and leave some time to turn this back to you and the group that's here. The paper spends time with the prosaic, and the prosaic is sort of where I'm interested to map out relationality and the materialities in a very everyday way that support what right now is identified with the GLO and the immiserating process of international law. And the quote that I have here is that the prosaic reality of PIL regulates, so here it's PIL, right? It's not IEL and it's not GLO. The prosaic reality of PIL regulates not only our travels, communications, and entertainment, but also the clothes we wear, the food we consume, and the technologies we use. It regulates the way in which resources are moved around the world, concentrated in some places while desperately lacking in others. But bluntly, it maintains and directs the flows of wealth and poverty in our radically unjust world. This substratum of PIL, now here you are pushing back to the GLO with substratum. The substratum of PIL operates quietly behind the spectacular failures of the laws of peace and humanity. It directly affects material reality, manifesting the actual functioning of PIL. So there's in that sort of text, there's a fluidity that lets us sort of imagine a consolidated GLO working beneath PIL, and yet I don't think that paragraph works if you just put in GLO in place of PIL for all of the regulatory work. It defies the institutional heart of the GLO to say that it's regulating our travels, communications, and entertainment, as well as everything else. That's just hard to pin to the front line of the World Bank.
Yeah.
Right. And yet, I think that this prosaic element of control in regulation is very much what stabilizes the possibility of institutions like the WTO and the World Bank doing what they do. So I almost sort of invert at that point the order of priority and how to identify what's at work and what's at stake. The form of the GLO, at one point it's a competent and powerful, okay, so I'm jumping to a different quote. A competent, but it has to do with the form of the GLO. A competent and powerful legal case may be made against such military misadventures. Pick your military misadventure for anyone who hasn't read the paper. Yet they too are actualizations of PIL. They could not occur without PIL functioning to allow, weapons procurement, training, movement and overflight of troops and munitions, overseas military bases, alliances, and even the basic provisioning of the troops themselves. Like the effects of the GLO, so we are in space outside of the GLO proper. These imperialist crusades, however unlawful they are condemned to be, remain actualizations of PIL, legality in action. I mean, absolutely. And these actualizations, now outside of the quote, which extend beyond IEL and are in the name of public international law, suggests that there's some actualization in the domain of PIL that's extending the boundaries as they're sort of mapped for the GLO phenomenon. Yeah. And these passages ask me to look for this thing, the more than IEL, more than international economic law. I apologize for all the acronyms to everyone. I don't usually do this. And to you too, Jason. This is what happens when I read from my own shorthand. So what exactly is then the form of the GLO as a consistent practice field? It comprises interlocking institutions and neoliberal technocrats. Yeah. But it's got elements of training that exceed what that all too short summary might suggest. So I'd argue, here, let me bring in the ethical to get to a final point about training. I would suggest that, and I've tried to suggest that ethical international law or international law in its ethical register isn't exactly immaterial. And I just see too close a connection between the production of ethical rhetoric in international law and the material practice of immiseration. I don't actually think that you can, I don't know, but I have an intuition that the immiserating practices of international simply aren't possible without its ethical component, without its ethical production, in which case I have a very hard time calling it immaterial. Not because it's actually doing the work that the immiserating practices do, but because it's bound up in these material networks, it's satisfying some material need or desire that becomes a condition of possibility for these conjoined practices that happen in other institutional spaces or at other professional moments. Yeah. So now then, through that a little bit to the training, against this backdrop of a big professional space with questions of ethical and material practices, I'm curious about the roles in this space, how they're learned or observed, and where we can intervene in them. So at one point, academics don't do law. We explain and illustrate what we think doing law means. This is a quote. We describe and so validate the conduct of those we think of as practitioners. In doing so, we self-referentially authenticate them as officials in our imaginary legal systems. I think that's a powerful quote, but it speaks to a certain priority. I'm not sure whether academics have earned that priority, but we are busy constructing something. In the ways that we reproduce these knowledges and the ethical comforts of the practices we engage are also part of it, a strategic or tactical map, ultimately. You bring in Nadina Tsuvala's work with respect to the reproduction of courtroom practices outside of the courtroom. And that to me was very useful, especially because I know of a couple projects, for instance, by Wouter Werner, together with Christine Schwebel and Sarah Kendall and some others, who are trying to undo the idea of moot courts and use a completely inverted idea of moot court, well, maybe not completely inverted, but a very scrambled idea of moot court to train a different sort of practice. And I wonder, I know through Wouter's work, a lot of attention is paid on what just the repetition of the professional role does for the production of international lawyers. Sort of the Pascal point, if you bend the knee, you believe, right? So, you know, what happens if we go into our training and start to bend the other knee? Can we find places where the roles can be intervened in and shaken up? And so here I really will conclude. There are just a couple of quotes that are extremely powerful. The paper is a call to problematize the institution's sacred texts and exegetical styles we've inherited, adopted, or developed. And I think very much of small, but maybe useful interventions like this one with respect to moot courts as a sort of tiny step towards doing something. We should reflect on our situated selves, our communities of practice. What do they demand from us? What do they give us? But also, what do they do in the world? I know that it's at a number of points in my not terribly illustrious career, I've already become complicit in so many of the things that I tried to push back against. So, you know, for that reason, when I read the paper and hear the comments, I'm eager to find the concrete places where resistance can happen without but in a way that doesn't sort of fall into the trap of a feudal charge on a very resilient broad infrastructure. I'll stop there. That feels like I rambled a very long time.
Thank you very much for those very comprehensive reflections. Let me first give the floor to questions of participants. I don't know, can you raise your hands here? I can see you, but I can't really see whether or not someone has a question. So yeah, if you do have a question, I don't know, I could just ask or allow everyone to talk. If I can't, yeah, should I just put the 6 current attendees, I just allow all of them to talk. So if any one of you guys want to raise a question, please go ahead. Yes, Isabel.
Hello. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Jeff, for a fantastic paper, and also Jeff's comments as well, very illuminating. I've got about 1,000 questions I could ask because it's such a packed paper. I mean, really, it has everything in it. And I suppose one of the things that I'd like to think a little bit about is what it is that international lawyers do. So one of the things that comes out in your paper, Jason, is that you imagine that what we're doing is arguing. And I just want to wonder if actually that's what we're doing all the time, we're arguing. What about the project making? Because project making is not necessarily argumentative in form. And so I just wondered if we think about it like that, what throwing that into the mix does.
Can you explain what you mean by project making?
So I suppose it might have lots of different forms, but in one version of project making, we might have quite a kind of managerial register where project making is really about setting a goal and then finding key performance indicators and writing down, like the kind of project making that a university does, delivering a strategy, that kind of project making. And it seems to me that at least in my context, I'm at Queen Mary in London, a lot of the students now, this kind of thinking comes to them much more readily than a kind of argumentative approach to legal text comes to them. So I'm much more likely to end up marking a paper that ends with a set of recommendations for future development than I am with a kind of a paper that treats international law as this radically indeterminate, arguable thing. In fact, what I'm finding is that often students find it quite difficult to deal with the idea of that legal norms are indeterminate and arguable.
Yeah. I mean, I think international lawyers that study, international law students that study in law schools, in mainstream law schools, are at a disadvantage in that they have been so ideologically conditioned to refuse the indeterminacy of law that the concept is alien, that indeterminate law becomes almost a contradiction in terms. But I think that even the project building still falls within this kind of, Jeff's got me a bit worried about saying immateriality, but I'm going to stick with immateriality for just now. This immateriality of international law, both in the sense that different projects could be pursued or different key performance indicators could be raised, but also because it makes me think about things like the Millennium Development Goals that were designed to do exactly this, but it's, as a project, as Jeff sort of said, its only real production is an ethical discourse and a set of normative hopes behind which terrible things continue to happen. Or to put that in a slightly different way, I think in the same way that legal arguments are false contingencies, so these sort of managerial proposals are also false contingencies. It's one thing when the university does it because the administration have control over the institution, but when we try to move them into this non-institutionalized space of international law, they just become further, at least for me, they become further objects for argument. They become another set of data that we can build ethical projects or counter projects around. Did that answer your question, Isabel? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, that was super interesting. I suppose one of the things I wonder about is the difference between, and I think that this word immaterial, as Jeff picked up on, is quite problematic, I think. But one of the things I'm wondering is, to go back to an older and equally problematic word that we were all using ages ago, about effectiveness. So one of the things I'm thinking is that quite a lot of the time, what you're calling immaterial is ineffective in its own terms, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have effects, and that those effects are felt, even if where it's having felt effects might be either very diffuse or marginal as well. So, for example, managerial things very often do have effects, even if they're not the effects they want, because they end up meaning that resources are spent in particular ways. And so in development agendas, it often means that the things that are prioritized, the things that people end up spending their time on, it depends on the funder rather than the needs of the country in which it's going on, the communities in which they're going on. So that kind of thing is, I guess, what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the materiality point is a really important one. I think that this thing that I call the global legal order is part of material international law, but it's definitely not all of material international law. And in the sense that ethical rhetoric in some ways facilitates immiserating practices by drawing attention to the wrong spaces, in that sense, all international law becomes material. It has a material effect. The one that I particularly wanted to look at in this paper, although I didn't use the word, was international law's ongoing colonial function. And my argument would be that international law, for most of its life, had two purposes. It had to facilitate the plunder of resources, and it had to justify the plunder of resources. But those two purposes have become curiously unmoored from one another. So the plunder of resources, because it's no longer nakedly colonial, comes with a set of its own technocratic and moralistic justifications, debt discourse, development discourse, etc. So international law no longer needs to serve its old role as justifying, is no longer tied to the material practices that it justifies and hides. And it's sort of therefore free to spin off and create fantasies about how the world should be. So, when I think about things like full legislatures, my current favorite short story in international law is the Human Rights Committee's General Comment 36, where they took a right not to be arbitrarily killed by the state and they turned it into an alleged right to be kept alive in even the most complex and trying circumstances. And some people have taken it seriously, as if this is now a legal standard that states are somehow obligated to live up to. Whereas what I think it's doing is it's making the systems that take life invisible. So it's seeing the right to life in terms of protection, but not in terms of the provision. So it talks about the right to life, including the right to a clean environment, healthcare, food, shelter, decent income, etc. So a right to life that we would recognize as a right to a European life, but that completely distracts from the fact that that life is materially unavailable to the vast, vast majority of the Earth's population. Jeff, coming back to systems theory, I hadn't even thought about that. But I did read an unfortunate amount of Luhmann and Teubner for my PhD 20 some years ago, and that trauma may be lingering on.
Can I intervene for a second? Because the systems, to stay with Isabel's comments in your responses, also in the Register of Systems Theory, because it, maybe it's more just a name game, but moving from systems theory to systems analysis, these sorts of questions, program building as opposed to argumentative engagement, do seem to me part of the program sketched out by the conclusion of your paper. For instance, yeah, if I'm trying to find the places where the GLO is at work, and if I do find some of the particular places, and I go there ready to meet the argumentative practices of the lawyers in their very slippery space of structural indeterminacy, but what I meet instead is optimization routines trained in groups at a business school, I'm not going to fight very well. I'm going to come wrongly prepared. And as you multiply these sorts of distinctions in the professional routines, and Isabel, I don't know if this is part of what you have in mind when you ask the question, but it's certainly something that I'm very interested in, especially as I start to think about sort of socio-technical systems, including the machines that people are working with to connect themselves to form something like portions of the GLO. It requires a certain management expertise that has a very particular flavor, not a constant one over time either, to make that work, right? And so contesting that, to me, I think takes us beyond the typical. Contesting that as a critic then requires critical tools that go beyond the concern with the indeterminacy of legal argumentation. And yeah, I mean, so I precisely because I see the sympathy for this coming from you and already in parts of the paper, I think it's worth highlighting in terms of what that can do as next step from here.
Isabel?
Yeah, no, very much what I had in mind, that actually, if we think about the sorts of, when you're thinking about that fragmentation of international lawyers, I think that question of the sorts of processes and these optimization and developing programs and cyclical blah blah blah, all of that kind of stuff, I think another thing to think about is how they can create a false sense that there is coherence and consensus and that kind of thing. And as Jeff says, these ways of coming together and ways of joining up things, not just people but different ideas. And I think it's worth kind of going into that more, not just thinking about separates, but thinking about the things that are connecting.
I think this is true. Whether I have the talent to draw a map that complex, I'm not so sure. But no, I mean, I steer away from it in this presentation, but for me, the underlying problem remains neoliberal hegemony. When these optimization plans are produced, they assume a certain economic dogma, which taken on its own terms has consistently failed. The economic interventions under the GLO have progressively made countries poorer, more unequal, and more miserable, and yet they're allowed to remain on this terrain of the technical, on this terrain of the managerial, on this terrain of the procedure that we develop and roll out and the indicators that we create. And I mean, if I could choose to do anything, it would be to find a way to knock that sort of scientific set of assumptions or set of pseudo-scientific assumptions in a way that people could look at the development project and say, it's not the details that are wrong, it's the system that's wrong. And they don't. Instead, they say, no, the system models perfectly, but this detail hasn't been taken into account. Or we've liberalized trade, but we've failed on the rule of law. There's always a reason that the system doesn't work, rather than even a baseline engagement with the idea that maybe the system doesn't work. But where that leads in terms of interventions, I don't know.
So, Jason, what if I took like a crudely Gramscian approach to it and said, yeah, it's hard to get people to buy into a rejection of the system, but partially because that won't happen by just asking them to overturn everything all at once. And instead, we need to just sort of move the trench incrementally.
Yeah.
How I guess part of what was behind the comments was trying to figure out how incrementally to move the trench in light of the study that you've just produced. I struggle to think of where I would do it, against what, and how. Yeah.
Yep.
And I worry that in the meantime, I'll keep banging my head about the enormity of the problem and convincing myself that it's too enormous to tackle.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a problem, and in a way, this was intended. I mean, obviously, all writing is normative, but this was intended as a very descriptive paper. I was trying to lay out how I think international law currently operates and why I think that is insufficient. But I mean, it is interesting that the World Bank and even the IMF's rhetoric on austerity has been blown apart by the financial crisis and by COVID. But what I don't see yet is how we turn that rhetorical change into a policy change. So they're now saying, oh, all the things that we said were bad were actually good. Do invest in your economy, do go into counter-cyclical spending, etc. But the states that they've intervened in, they don't have the resources or the policy space to do that. But I also am very wary, because my students raise it every now and again, that I have a bad habit of underplaying the agency of the underdeveloped worlds. That I tend, I have this weird European thinking that we caused the problem and it's our obligation to fix it. But as I said, you just have to look at the Poland-Belarus border to know that we have no interest in fixing this problem.
Any other questions?
I think, in fairness, that was a characteristically depressing final statement on my part. So we could say that an hour and a half was a good innings.
I was asking myself, maybe I can ask a question. I was asking myself, where would we be if this, what's the alternative? Where would we be if this imaginary PIL wasn't there at all? Where would we be in a better, from your perspective, would we be in a better place?
I think we'd be one step closer to understanding the world. I mean, as I say, I don't think this is deliberate, but one of the functions of ethical international law is that it presents the world as an essentially ethical place where bad things happen as an aberration. Whereas what I try to argue in this paper is that bad things happening is the normal, and good things happening is an aberration that only applies to the 15% of the global population that have the luxury of living in the overdeveloped world or in one of its satellites like AUC in the underdeveloped world.
Here, Jason, so, and if you don't mind if I keep coming back and pushing the time out a little bit more, but I'll sort of riff from your students there. I mean, I'm really sympathetic to that. So, I mean, I don't want to push too hard, but at the same time, there's something very Hobbesian about that vision and very European about it, no? and it sounds almost like you're reproducing. I mean, the European system projected imperially assumes that the world's in a state of war and our institutions carve us out from them. You know, we get out of the state of nature with these great liberal political institutions. And by flipping that, by suggesting that the projection out of the institutions is a world of peace, and that war is the exception, you're creating, through your own realism, you're recreating a Hobbesian vision. No? Maybe this is all too academic to really have purchase and so an abuse of your students' insight. But at the same time, I do wonder whether the catastrophic vision doesn't have an element of calling parts of its own frustrations into being, part of its own anxieties into being.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, one part of the problem for me is my own situationality, that I live this incredibly bourgeois life in the global south, in the underdeveloped world, and I'm very, very conscious of that. And I'm conscious of that because it's Europe in a microcosm. The problem with the overdeveloped world is that it is addicted to luxury. It's addicted to consumption. You know, and this is not a new thought. W.E.B. Du Bois was saying this in 1915 in The African Roots of War. And, you know, well, we've essentially just shown it in Glasgow in the last 2 weeks that we would rather burn the planet than give up on our luxuries. And I don't know how to undermine that. Yeah, I mean, as I said, given my own positionality, I don't even know how to undermine that for myself.
Yeah. Okay. So if there are no further questions, there's one question from Hashim who asks if the recordings are going to be uploaded and sent to participants. Jason, could you respond to that? Is that?
I could if I could type, yes. Okay. This is my email. I should get a copy of this recording tomorrow. So if you want a copy of the recording, please email me and I will send it to you.
Okay, great. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
So you're talking about colonial international law. I'm not a lawyer, I'm in media, so I'm not really sure exactly what that means, but I sort of understand that it's a European sort of luxurious understanding of how the world operates. So can that change? Can there be bodies or projects from the third world? Like, well, I'm in Egypt, so can there be initiatives coming from countries like Egypt and the third world to touch on and talk about the other side of the all the other problems?
Yeah, so this is a really tricky question. So part of the problem with the way this thing that I call the GLO functions is that it locks macroeconomic choices and often political choices in place. So the underdeveloped world at the official, at the formal level, has much less legal freedom of action than the overdeveloped world do.
Yeah.
They also have a basic shortage of resources. Now, one thing that could be done would be to move away from the development agenda and move towards a much more distributive agenda. And to a limited extent, that could be done within a country like Egypt. But when it came to the point of threatening the wealth of the foreign investors who plunder Egypt, they would have legal protections that would prevent the redistribution of their resources. I like generally Jason Hickel has, it's a first world idea, but has an idea that he calls de-development, that the overdeveloped world needs to, you genuinely start focusing on consuming less and having less luxurious expectations of our lives so that there is more to go around, so that migrants aren't drawn towards the wealth that we plundered from them. I really like Hickel's work, but he is a more optimistic human being than I am.
Okay, thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
It's also a moment to point to a number of bodies of scholarship and activism that are trying to operate from a base outside of a Eurocentric position, geographically or otherwise. So third world approaches to international law would be one.
Yeah.
The sort of broadest umbrella, and there are specific projects going around in various places, Hashem, that Jason will know even better than I, that can be taken up separately.
No, I wouldn't say that's true. I mean, you're in GLAN, which is one of these projects.
Yeah, although that one still operates from a European center, GLAN. I mean, it's taking up, it's trying to work in novel ways. But I'm thinking, for instance, of Anthony Angi's group in Singapore, or the Apronomics Law blog, which is connected up with a variety of different groups and actions.
Yeah, I think the TWAIL review as well. TWAIL-R.
So sorry, so just another question, just more clarification. So is the resistance coming from the actual European structure of international law, or is it coming from the third world country not wanting to reveal, atrocities, secrets, human rights violations? I mean, Jason, you're in Egypt also, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Again, I'm talking just as a media person, don't know all the different terms, but how come you can't be running some sort of European international law? I'm not saying you, Jason Beckett, so just some that did live overseas that has studied law. Why can't you be running something like an international body, some sort of outsource here in Egypt, protecting the views of the third world? Why isn't that available? Or is
I mean, to some extent it is. The problem I have, very simply, is that I can't get my work published.
Because of the resistance from here, or from Europe?
No, I just don't seem to be at all popular with law journals. I have had no problems with Egypt.
Okay.
It's just that for some reason, when I say that international law is not a very good idea, international law journals don't like to publish that.
That's fair enough.
Yeah, but it is fair, but it's irritating as well.
Yeah, so that's on the from an academic point of view, publishing works. But what about from an activism point of view, as an international lawyer doing work from a third world country, protecting, the rights of the third world, not as an academic, more as a practitioner?
Yeah. So I guess the really central problem with that is I'm not a practitioner. I never really left law school. I trained as an undergrad, then I did my master's, then my PhD, then I started teaching. So I've only ever lived as an academic.
Okay. Are there any practitioners with that European mentality living in third world countries trying to make
I'm
new
sure that there must be, but very often the problem, at least from my perspective, is that those organizations target their own governments rather than seeing that human rights abuses have much more structural, much more global causes. They're not just the willful bad acts of bad people. They are systemically rational, even systemically necessary responses. But that's a whole other paper on neocolonialism.
Oh, interesting. Because as a media practitioner here, I've done some work with the SIS service here in Egypt, which they do all the responses to Congress and human rights violations. They answer back to the Human Rights Authority in Europe, in America, about what's happening in Egypt, and they're not trained on how to answer the really rough, tough questions.
Mhm.
So definitely would be interested to know why we don't have anything in the third world to be able to combat what people are getting accused of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another part of that is that many third world law schools remain deeply colonized places. They remain deeply Eurocentric in their structure, their postures, and their understanding of law.
Mm-hmm. They're more interested in local law, aren't they, more than the international scope? From what I've been here for 7 years, so that's what I've seen. And no one talks about international law here.
Yeah, is not
Okay.
hugely popular with the current government.
Yeah.
And I also think that law, in particularly in Egypt, right? It's not it's not something that is very popular amongst Egyptians to study. So usually law schools attract students. I mean, if you're from Egypt, you know how it works. Usually those students with good grades go into engineering and medicine, and then law schools usually get the ones that.
There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that because since 1952, the country's been under sort of state of emergency. So they think they're in a war, continuous war. So in war, you don't need thinkers. You need medical people. You need engineers to build bridges, and you need a general to control everyone. That's it. So you don't want thinkers because thinkers are going to convict the bad guys. Well, I shouldn't be saying that, but so that's why the law is considered it's 57% out of 100 in year 12 to get into law. In Australia, it's 98.9 to get into law because they need the thinkers over there. Here, they don't need the thinkers. That's the difference. They just need service people like, engineers and doctors to, fix the wounded and build bridges and keep moving forward.
I don't know. Maybe that gives lawyers a bit too much credibility and too much credit. I don't know if lawyers are particularly the ones that are, I would consider the thinkers. Usually lawyers are the ones that apply the law, right? And there's a great need of that in Egypt. It's the critical. It's a vicious cycle, but maybe that exceeds the scope of this conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, really interesting. But I believe definitely, like, I'm not a lawyer. I'd love to study law one day, but I definitely think lawyers are philosophers, they're thinkers, they're artists in a way. They control, I mean, in America, all the presidents are all ex-lawyers, aren't they? There's a reason for that. In Australia, it's similar, everyone in parliament is an ex-lawyer. So here it's a complete opposite. You're either going to be a businessman or a doctor or an engineer. And there's a reason for that. But anyway,
I don't know if I concur with this. Like, I studied law in Germany and I haven't produced a single independent thought until my PhD, because we were trained for 8 years, literally 8 years.
But you're a strategist, but as a lawyer, you're a strategist. I mean, you're following law. I mean, you're producing the encrypted law, but you're strategizing how to put it forward. That's thinking, isn't it?
I think you're going to find law school really disappointing.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, no, law school is about memorizing rules that someone told you are important.
Yeah, but then how do I apply them? Then I apply them in a different way to maybe another lawyer?
Oh, just so that you fail at law school, you apply them the way your professor says they apply.
Ah, okay.
Honestly, I tried not doing that and I very nearly failed law school. So you apply them the way your professor says they apply.
Wow, okay.
All right. I think we are done with the substance, right?
Yeah.
Any further questions? Thank you very much, Jason and Jeff. This was very, very interesting.
Let me say my thanks again. This has been a real honor. I mean that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Hashem. And thank you to the rest of you who stuck
Thank
with
you.
us to the bitter end. That's much appreciated.
So if I send you an email, Jason, can you send me the upload, please?
Yes, I will do as soon as I get it.
I actually sent you an email for the last mercenary lecture, and you never responded. So
Oh, sorry. My email, I've only been concentrating on dissertations. All my students are panicking at the moment.
are they? Okay, cool. All right, thanks, guys. Really refreshing to hear all this. And if I get into law school, I'll let you know.
Good luck.
Good luck.
See ya.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, bye, bye,
See you,
bye,
Jeff.
bye,
See
bye.
ya.